Greetings, my friends, and may the Lord be with you. Our confirmation class has been studying Martin Luther and his small catechism. And when you read about the life of the reformer who launched the religious movement that brought the church we all love into being, you find yourself back in the Middle Ages, a time in history when people, to borrow the words of one author, lived with an almost childlike emotional intensity. There were stark contrasts at that time, he writes, between daytime and darkness, between summer heat and winter cold, between misery and exuberance, and between good and evil. Material things were consecrated with spiritual powers, the author continues. God was thought to live in the stones of the cathedrals, and miracles inurned in the bones of the saints. The world seemed spiritually alive, and the power of spirit could overshadow politics. An interesting time, to be sure. Now, actually, I think it's true that no matter how sophisticated or cynical or hard-nosed we in the 21st century may be, we can all benefit from grabbing on to moments when we can turn away from what we have become, people who focus only on the facts of modern life, the math and science of it all, and instead allow ourselves to experience the spiritual side of things. Or to put it a little differently, each of us needs to be enchanted now and then. Enchanted by a pair of finches pecking away at the bird feeder in our backyard. Enchanted by the soft light of the full moon on a warm spring evening. Enchanted, indeed, by the palpable presence of God's Spirit. The childlike emotional intensity that was part of the daily experience of people in the Middle Ages is something we modern folks cannot afford to lose. It's a gift from God. And more importantly, that capacity for enchantment or emotional intensity or awe or whatever word or phrase we might use to describe this state is a key component of our capacity to experience God. In this state of being, we don't just think about God or contemplate God or wonder about God. Rather, we truly experience a connection to the one who, as Paul puts it so well, is not far from each one of us, but rather is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. Paul's wonderful description of God was part of his sermon to the residents of Athens, which at the point in history that these words were written was the intellectual and philosophical center of the known world, the home of the great philosophers, orators, sculptors, painters, and poets. In that sermon, the only one recorded that was preached to a Gentile audience, by the way, Paul tells his sophisticated, educated listeners that God is not somewhere else. No, God is right here, all around us. I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, Paul says to the Athenians, and I found among those objects an altar with the inscription, "To an unknown God." To those of you who grope for God, Paul continues, know this: God is not far from us. In fact, we are God's offspring. God is that close. In Paul's Athenian sermon, he reminds his listeners, and indeed reminds us, that the search for God is not just an intellectual exercise. He reminds us that the religious life is not a search for a God that's out there, but to the contrary, it's a process of entering into a relationship with a God who is right here. And perhaps even more importantly, Paul points out that even well-meaning, generally religious human beings like you and me can inevitably turn in the wrong direction. But God never abandons us. He's right, of course. Again and again throughout history, God has broken through our limited understanding, intervened when we stepped out of line, corrected our wrong images, and opened us to new possibilities. I see how extremely religious you are in every way, Paul tells the Athenians. I walked around this city of yours. I looked carefully at the objects of your worship and was pleased to see you were looking for God, reaching for God, longing for God. But you're looking in the wrong places. If you want to find God, look to the one who has been raised from the dead. You see, the miracle of the resurrection of Jesus is the reason God, to use Paul's phrase, is not far from each of us. We simply can't make God come any closer because of the resurrection, which we continue to remember during this Easter season, coronavirus or no coronavirus. God lives in each of us. The psalmist beautifully captures this closeness to God in Psalm 139. Where can I go from your spirit? The psalmist asks. Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, in the underworld, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. Somehow, though, we humans, despite all of that, still drift away from God, push away sometimes. We still break the connection with the one who is the ground of our being. Perhaps it's because the unmerited gift of God's grace is ours, given freely to us in spite of our generally rotten selves. Just perhaps it's because that seems too good to be true. Or perhaps it's because the thought of a life lived in the presence of God simply causes us to hide, causes us to try to escape. Or perhaps it's because the intensity of an intimate relationship with God is just not sustainable 24/7. As some of us are fond of saying in normal times anyway, we need our space. Well, my friends, just possibly, the life you and I have been living with the space we have all been forced to create over the past months, perhaps that will cause us to want to draw closer to, not farther from, the awesome, powerful force that we know is there, but we can't begin to truly understand. Because you see, God is the very ground of our existence. God is why we are who we are. In God, again to use Paul's words, we live and move and have our being. With the Athenians of old, you and I naturally grope for God. Particularly during a pandemic, we need to feel the presence of God with that childlike emotional intensity I talked about before. We need to allow God's presence to wash over us like the waves of an ocean. On the other hand, though, it is still true that knowing that the awesome presence of God is inescapable can cause us to retreat. It can cause us to put up roadblocks in an attempt to keep God away. Paul suggests that the answer to this dilemma, The resolution of this tension lies in the act of repentance. And the psalmist, when he pens one of the great prayers of all time, provides us with the words to use to seek that repentance. The words of this prayer are found in the concluding lines of the same psalm I quoted before. So let the psalmist's prayer be ours today, my friends, and our prayer each time we stand open and vulnerable before the awesome one. In the words of the psalmist, pray with me now. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Amen. And may the peace of God be with you all.